Here is a question that intelligence analysts still can't fully answer. How do you destroy a country's air defenses from the inside without ever crossing its border yourself? Not a rhetorical question, a literal one. Because on the morning of June 13, 2025, that is exactly what happened. And the answer begins not with a general, not with a prime minister, not with a satellite image, but with a man lying on a mattress in a Tehran apartment building, staring at the ceiling, checking his watch for the fourth time in an hour. His name is not important. His code name, the only identifier that has surfaced in debriefs, is Echo Du. He is Iranian by birth. He speaks the language without an accent, buys his groceries at the same market every Thursday, nods to the same neighbor every morning. He has been living in this city for 4 months. He has not spoken to his family in 6 weeks. On the floor beside his mattress, a compact drone launcher and a sealed metal case he has been instructed not to open until he receives a specific signal. He has not received the signal yet. He checks his watch again. He has 11 minutes. This is not a story about jets and bunker busters and geopolitical strategy. Those things happened, they matter. But they were the final page of a document that took years to write, in safe houses in Ankara, in border towns in Azerbaijan, in apartments exactly like this one across at least a dozen Iranian cities. The document was written by people whose names will likely never appear in any official record. Some of them are still waiting to come home, some of them never will. What you are about to hear is how the Mossad built the infrastructure that made June 13th possible. Not the strike itself, what came before it. The years of work, the calculated risks, the wrong assumptions and the correct ones, and the single decision made with incomplete information, under pressure, by a man who didn't know if his own network was still intact, that nearly unraveled everything in the final hours. There is a fact about Iran's nuclear infrastructure that tends to get buried in the noise of diplomatic announcements and satellite imagery. It was not designed to survive a war. It was designed to survive the specific war that Israel could fight. That distinction took 20 years to build and was not accidental. Iranian planners studied every Israeli air campaign going back to the 1981 Osirak strike in Iraq, the 2007 operation against a Syrian reactor, and every exercise and doctrine shift that the Israeli Air Force published or leaked between then and now. They understood Israeli capabilities with the precision of people who had been waiting for an attack for 2 decades. The result was a layered architecture that, by 2024, had effectively closed most of the conventional options available to Israel. At the center of the problem was a facility called Fordo, a uranium enrichment complex not built on a mountain, but carved into one, nearly 300 feet of granite above its core chambers, hardened against standard bunker-penetrating munitions, hardened against the specific payloads carried by Israeli F-35s and F-15. The only weapon in the world capable of reaching Fordo's core was the GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator, a 30,000-pound bomb carried exclusively by American B-2 stealth bombers. Israel does not operate B-2s. Israel does not have GBU-57s. Fordo, in any purely Israeli operation, was functionally untouchable. But Fordo was only the deepest layer of the problem. Surrounding Iran's nuclear and military infrastructure was a web of air defense systems, S-300 batteries, domestically produced Bavar 373 platforms, arranged with overlapping radar coverage specifically designed to prevent an Israeli strike package from reaching its targets without detection. The geometry of Iranian air defense was not random. It had been constructed with Israeli attack profiles in mind, positioned to ensure that any approaching aircraft would be tracked minutes before it reached its target, giving Iranian crews time to engage. And underneath the air defense architecture was a third layer, command continuity. The IRGC, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, had spent years dispersing its senior leadership. Commanders rotated locations on irregular schedules. Communications were compartmentalized. Underground command bunkers had been built, hardened, and quietly upgraded. The logic was straightforward. Even if Israel somehow penetrated the air defenses and struck the nuclear facilities, the military and intelligence leadership would survive to direct the response. The regime would bleed, but not break. This was the problem that Mossad Director David Barnea, known internally as Dadi, sat with in the second half of 2024. The strategic window was opening. Hezbollah had been severely degraded in Lebanon. Gaza had absorbed global attention and political capital. Donald Trump had returned to the White House, and early signals from Washington suggested the new administration was not categorically opposed to a confrontation with Tehran. The window that Israeli planners had been waiting for, a moment when political, military, and diplomatic conditions aligned, was arriving. But the window was useless if the operation failed at the tactical level. And the tactical problem was this: you cannot blind an Iranian air defense battery from the other side of a border. You cannot decapitate a command structure with jets that will be detected before they arrive. You cannot destroy a radar installation by firing at it from outside its operational radius without triggering everything around it. To open the sky, you had to be inside the country before the jets took off. Not a drone, not a signal, a person on the ground, within striking range of a specific installation, armed, waiting. That requirement, so simple to state, so nearly impossible to execute, was the load-bearing wall of everything that followed. Here is the second problem, the one that didn't appear in any strategy document but lived in the back of every conversation Barnea had with his senior staff during those months. The Mossad had been inside Iran before. Networks had been built, activated, and burned. Operatives had been arrested. Several had been executed, some publicly, some quietly. Iranian counterintelligence, VEVAK, was not passive. It had been studying Israeli insertion methods for as long as Israel had been using them. It had informants in diaspora communities. It ran double agents. It had, on multiple occasions, identified Mossad-linked operatives before they could act and use them, consciously, to feed false intelligence back toward Tel Aviv. The Mossad could not simply rebuild what it had built before. Iran had studied the old model. VEVAK knew what to look for. Whatever Barnea was going to build had to be structurally different from anything that had come before. Different recruitment, different insertion, different operational logic, and it had to be large enough to activate across multiple cities simultaneously, without any single point of failure bringing down the whole structure. The question that no one in that planning room could fully answer was this: at the scale required, across the geography required, involving the number of people required, could a network that large stay secret long enough to matter? Echo? Du was not recruited because he was a trained operative. He was recruited because he was angry. He had spent 3 years outside Iran after an encounter with the Basij that left marks he does not discuss. He had rebuilt a life in a neighboring country, a job, a routine, a small apartment. He was not looking to become an intelligence asset. He was not ideologically aligned with Israel. He did not, in the early months of his contact with the Mossad's intermediaries, even know with certainty who was approaching him. The initial meeting was in a cafe in Ankara. The conversation was about politics, about the regime, about what it had taken from him and from people like him. It didn't mention money, it didn't mention Israel, it didn't ask him to do anything. He came back for the second meeting because someone had, for the first time in years, asked him what he actually thought and listened to the answer. By the time the real conversation began, 3 meetings later, Echo Do had already decided he would say yes. He underwent psychological evaluation, polygraph testing, and 5 months of training. At some point during that training, he was brought to a facility where a physical replica, a scale model of his assigned target had been built. He practiced the approach, the deployment sequence, the extraction route, until the sequence was automatic, until he could run it in the dark, under stress, with his hands shaking. Because when the moment came, he had been told he would not have the luxury of thinking. What he had not been told, what no one in his cell had been told, was that by the time they were activated, at least one other cell in the network had already gone dark. Not compromised, not arrested, simply gone silent. And no one in Tel Aviv yet knew why. The Mossad had a word for the approach it was abandoning. For decades, the operational logic had been built around what insiders called Israeli hands, operatives born, trained, and ideologically anchored in Israel, inserted into target countries under cover identities with foreign documentation. The system had produced extraordinary results in Europe, in South America, in the Gulf. It had also repeatedly produced catastrophic failures in Iran specifically. The problem wasn't the quality of the operatives, the problem was the country. Iran's internal security architecture had been built, in part, by studying Israel. VEVAK analysts had spent years cataloging patterns, the kinds of covers Israeli operatives used, the neighborhoods they gravitated toward, the communication methods they preferred, the small behavioral tells that distinguished a trained intelligence officer from someone who had actually grown up shopping in a Tehran bazaar. By 2022, the Mossad's internal assessments were clear. The old insertion model was functionally compromised. Vivek wasn't waiting to catch Israeli operatives anymore. It was anticipating them. Barnea's answer was to stop sending Israelis, not to reduce Israeli involvement, to restructure the entire model so that Israeli operatives never crossed the Iranian border at all, and every person who did had a reason to be there that no counterintelligence service could credibly question, because it was true. The Tzomet division, the Mossad's foreign recruitment arm, was expanded quietly and significantly. New station chiefs were assigned to cities with large Iranian diaspora populations: Istanbul, Yerevan, Baku, Dubai, Berlin. The recruitment mandate was not to find people who wanted to be spies. It was to find people who had a reason to hate the regime and the capability to act inside it. Iran had provided an almost inexhaustible supply of both. 40% of Iran's population belongs to ethnic minorities: Azeris in the northwest, Kurds along the western border, Arabs in Khuzestan, Baluchis in the southeast. Decades of Persian cultural dominance, economic neglect, and at times violent suppression had produced in each of these communities a reservoir of grievance that ran generational. These were not people the Mossad had to radicalize. They arrived pre-motivated. The Mossad's job was to find them, evaluate them, and give them a direction. The recruitment approach was deliberately indirect. An initial contact, never Israeli, often a trusted intermediary from the same ethnic community, would initiate a conversation in a neutral location: Turkey for the Azeris and Kurds, Armenia for those with family in the north, the UAE for Iranians with business ties abroad. The conversation would begin with grievance, not with an offer. The intermediary would listen, they would share, they would return. By the third or fourth meeting, a picture of the candidate had been assembled. Not from what they said, but from how they said it, what they avoided, what made them lean forward in their chair. Those who passed the informal evaluation were moved to formal assessment, psychological profiling, polygraph testing, a structured interview process designed to identify not just motivation but stability. An angry person is a useful asset. An unstable angry person is a liability that will eventually, under pressure, make the wrong decision. Those who cleared formal assessment entered training. The training pipeline varied by operational role. Infrastructure agents, those tasked with receiving, storing, and maintaining equipment caches inside Iran, required different preparation than commando team members assigned to direct action on the night of the strike. Infrastructure agents needed patience, cover story discipline, and the ability to sit on a secret for months or years without behavioral change. Commando team members needed tactical skills, stress resistance, and the ability to execute a precise sequence in conditions of maximum uncertainty. Some recruits were brought to Israel, others trained in third countries, locations where the Mossad maintained facilities that appeared, to local authorities, to be something entirely unremarkable. At certain training locations, scale models had been constructed. Physical replicas of specific Iranian installations, radar platforms, anti-aircraft battery positions, relay stations, built to accurate dimensions from satellite imagery and human reconnaissance. Recruits trained on these models until the layout was part of their muscle memory, until they could navigate them in complete darkness. The final structure, as it stood by early 2025, comprised 2 parallel groups, 14 teams in each, 4 to 6 members per team. Code names drawn from combinations of musical notes, a detail that, on its surface, is trivial, but which reflects a specific operational philosophy. Code names that carry no geographic, ethnic, or operational meaning cannot be used, if captured, to identify mission parameters. By March 2025, the teams were in place. The equipment caches had been positioned. The training was complete. And that is the point at which the first serious fracture appeared, not in Iran, in Tel Aviv. A routine signals review, the kind conducted weekly across all active operations, flagged an anomaly in communication patterns associated with a cell operating in the Khuzestan region in Iran's southwest. The cell had 2 members. Their last confirmed contact had been 16 days earlier. The gap was within protocol. Extended silence was sometimes operationally necessary, but the timing was wrong. They were approaching an activation window. Silence now was not a tactical choice, it was a problem. The initial assessment from the case officer managing the Khuzestan cell was equipment failure. Communication devices degraded, battery failure in a harsh environment, a dead drop that hadn't been serviced. Explainable, recoverable. The secondary assessment, generated 48 hours later by a different analyst reviewing the same data, was less comfortable. The cell had made a routine market purchase 11 days prior, a pre-agreed signal indicating normal status embedded in an ordinary transaction. But the purchase had been made at the wrong market, not the designated location, a different one 4 streets away, close enough that it might be an error, different enough that it might be a duress signal, a pre-agreed indicator that an operative was under surveillance or control. The problem was that the duress protocol used a specific market, and the purchase had been made at a third location that appeared on neither list. It could mean nothing. It could mean the operative had simply changed routine. It could mean the operative was compromised and was attempting to communicate something outside the established protocol because the established protocol itself had been compromised. There was no clean answer. There was no way to contact the cell directly without risking exposure. The only option was surveillance, watching from a distance for further signals. Barnea was briefed on June 1st, 12 days before the operation. The meeting that followed, reconstructed from accounts of 2 people present, was not a calm, strategic discussion. It was the kind of conversation that intelligence operations produce when the thing you have spent years building is suddenly, possibly, cracked. The question on the table was direct: do we proceed? One senior officer argued for delay. The Khuzestan anomaly was unresolved. If that cell was compromised, VEVAK potentially knew that something was coming. Not the details, not the date, but the existence of a network preparing for activation. Delaying would allow time to assess, to burn the compromised elements, to restructure. The counterargument was equally direct. The strategic window was not indefinite. The Trump administration's willingness to authorize American bunker busters against Fordo had been communicated through back channels, but it was contingent on Israeli action, not on Israeli preparation. Waiting was not a neutral choice. Waiting carried its own cost. And there was a third problem that the delay argument couldn't answer. If VEVAK already knew about the network, even partially, then delaying didn't solve the problem. It gave VEVAK more time to trace the network's edges, to identify the infrastructure agents, to quietly roll up the caches. A delayed operation might find, on activation night, that the equipment was gone, that the teams had been burned, that months of preparation had been handed to Iranian counterintelligence as a gift. The decision came down to a single, uncomfortable calculation. The Mossad could not determine whether the Khuzestan cell was compromised. It could not determine the extent of any potential exposure. It could not resolve the uncertainty. What it could determine was this: every day of delay increased the probability that the uncertainty would resolve in the wrong direction. Here is what that decision means for everything you have heard so far. The narrative that emerged after June 13th, in newspapers, in intelligence briefings, in the accounts of retired officials who spoke to journalists over the following months, described the operation as a masterpiece of preparation. Meticulous, patient, precise. A decade of groundwork activated in a single, synchronized window. That narrative is not false, but it is incomplete in a way that changes its meaning. The operation that launched on June 13, 2025, was not the operation that had been planned. It was a version of that operation, modified in the final 72 hours to account for a network that might already be partially compromised, activated over the objections of at least one senior officer, with a contingency structure hastily assembled to cover cells that had gone dark for reasons no one had fully resolved. The precision you witnessed, and it was genuine precision, the results speak to that, was not the precision of a plan executing as designed. It was the precision of trained people adapting, in real time, to a plan that had already begun to fracture. Echo Du did not know this when he received his activation signal. None of the 70-odd operatives activated that morning knew this. They believed they were executing a complete plan, fully intact, with every element accounted for. Some of them were right. At least one of them was not. And as the first teams began to move toward their targets in the early hours of June 13th, no one in Tel Aviv could tell you with certainty which was which. The signal arrived at 2:47 a.m., not a voice, not a message. A specific pattern of data noise embedded in a routine network ping. the kind of background traffic that Iranian signals intelligence processed and discarded 10,000 times a night. To any monitoring system, it was nothing. To Echo Du, lying on his mattress in the dark with his eyes already open, it was the beginning. He sat up slowly. He did not rush. Rushing was the thing his trainers had spent 5 months correcting out of him. In the first week, he had moved too fast on every simulated approach. Too much adrenaline, too much urgency, too much of the instinct that told a human body under stress to accelerate. Speed, his trainer had told him, is what gets you noticed. Stillness is what keeps you alive. He dressed in the dark, work clothes, unremarkable, the kind of thing a maintenance worker or a night shift laborer would wear. He opened the metal case on the floor. Inside, a compact drone system, folded into 3 components, and a triggering device roughly the size of a paperback book. He had assembled and disassembled this system so many times that his hands moved without instruction from his brain. He checked the battery indicator. Green. He checked the signal receiver. Green. He folded the case, tucked the components into a bag designed to look like tools, and moved toward the door. He stopped. The neighbor across the hall, an older man, a retired bureaucrat who kept irregular hours, had a habit of stepping into the corridor for a cigarette sometime between 2:30 and 4 a.m. Echo Du had charted this over 4 months. He had built it into his mental map of the building's rhythms. On any other night, it was background information. Tonight, it was a variable he could not afford. He stood at his door for 90 seconds listening. Nothing. He opened the door and moved into the corridor. The target was a Bavar 373 anti-aircraft battery position on the northwestern edge of the city, one of 4 installations covering the air corridor into Tehran's northern approach. It was not a large facility. A crew of 8, 2 radar arrays, a missile launcher, and a hardened revetment. From the outside, approaching on foot, it looked like a utility compound. Chain-link fence. Floodlights on motion sensors positioned along the outer perimeter. A guard post at the single vehicle entrance, staffed by 2 men on rotating 4-hour shifts. Echo Du had studied this position from a distance on 11 separate occasions over the previous 3 months. He knew the shift change times. He knew the blind spots in the floodlight coverage, 2 of them, both on the eastern side, both wide enough for a person to approach within 50 meters without triggering the motion sensors if they moved slowly. His assignment was not to enter the compound. The drone system had a range of 400 meters. He needed to get within that range, launch, and be gone before the crew inside the compound understood what was happening. He reached his approach position at 3:08 a.m., 11 minutes ahead of schedule. He assembled the drone in the shadow of a concrete utility structure, working by touch. The sequence: base plate, rotor assembly, payload housing, receiver sync. 32 steps. He had done it in under 4 minutes in training. Tonight, he reached step 19 and stopped. The receiver sync light was amber, not green. Amber. In training, amber indicated a partial connection. The device was reading the network but had not achieved a stable lock. The protocol was to wait up to 90 seconds for the lock to establish. If it didn't establish, the abort threshold was triggered automatically. He waited. At 60 seconds, the light was still amber. At 75 seconds, it flickered, green for 2 seconds, then back to amber. He had 30 seconds before the abort threshold. What Echo Du did next was not in the protocol. He reached into the bag and retrieved the triggering device, cycling it through a manual reset sequence his trainer had shown him once, briefly, as a footnote to a longer session on equipment failure. Not a formal procedure, a workaround, the kind of thing you weren't supposed to need. The receiver sync light went green. He did not pause to feel relieved. He finished the assembly and moved to his launch position. At 3:19 a.m., the drone lifted off in near silence. It crossed the outer perimeter of the compound in 11 seconds. The floodlights did not respond to it. It was too small, moving too low, its thermal signature below the sensor threshold. At a distance of 230 meters, the payload found its target, the primary radar array on the eastern side of the revetment. The explosion was not large. That was by design. Large explosions drew attention across a wide radius. This was a shaped charge, designed to destroy the specific hardware it contacted while producing minimal secondary effects. To anyone outside the compound, it might have sounded like a transformer failure. Inside the compound, the crew had approximately 4 seconds of confusion before the second drone, pre-positioned by a separate member of Echo Do's cell on the western approach, hit the launcher. The battery was gone. Echo Do began moving away from the site at a steady walking pace. For approximately 20 minutes, the operation appeared to be proceeding exactly as planned. Across the city and across the country, other teams were reporting in through their embedded signal protocols. The Mossad's command center in Tel Aviv was receiving confirmation indicators, not real-time communication, but the pre-agreed signals that meant a target had been hit and a team was withdrawing. The board was filling in, target after target, green indicators accumulating. There was a moment, somewhere between 3:20 and 3:40 a.m., when the people watching that board allowed themselves to believe that the thing they had spent years building might actually be working perfectly. It was a natural human response. It was also a mistake. The first indication that something was wrong came from a handler monitoring the Isfahan corridor, the air path that Israeli jets needed to use for the second strike wave, scheduled for dawn. The backup team assigned to the Isfahan radar installation, the cell that had been redirected after the original team went dark, had reached their target on schedule. They had confirmed approach. They had sent a pre-launch signal, and then, 12 minutes later, they sent a signal that was not in the confirmation sequence. It was not an abort signal, it was not a duress signal. It was a signal that, under the operational codebook, meant something that the handlers in Tel Aviv initially refused to believe they were reading correctly. The signal meant target layout does not match briefing. The Isfahan installation had been modified, not dramatically, not in a way that satellite imagery, reviewed as recently as 3 weeks prior, had flagged. But on the ground, in the dark, with a drone system calibrated for a specific approach angle and a specific target profile, the difference was critical. The primary antenna array had been repositioned, moved approximately 14 meters to the northwest, placed behind a new physical barrier that hadn't existed in the scale model the backup team had trained on. Not the target they had been given, not the geometry their equipment was calibrated for. The team leader had two options. He could abort, send the designated abort signal and withdraw, leaving the Isfahan air corridor partially uncleared for the dawn strike wave. Aborting was the safe choice. It was also the choice that, in approximately 90 minutes, would leave Israeli jets flying into an active radar envelope. He could adapt, recalculate the approach angle in real time, manually adjust the drone system's targeting parameters, and attempt to strike on a target whose exact current configuration he was working out from observation, in the dark, under time pressure, with equipment calibrated for a different geometry. He chose to adapt. This was the incorrect assumption playing out in real time, the team leader had assessed, based on the repositioned antenna's visible profile, that the underlying hardware configuration was standard and that his calibration adjustment would compensate. It was a reasonable inference from the information he had. It was also wrong. The first drone missed the primary hardware by 4 meters. The installation was damaged. It was not destroyed. A damaged radar system does not stop transmitting. It transmits badly, corrupted signals, degraded range, intermittent data. For a monitoring station trying to track approaching aircraft, degraded radar is almost worse than no radar. It produces ghost returns, false contacts, noise that can be misread as a threat profile. For Israeli pilots flying the dawn approach, degraded radar meant uncertain threat data. Not safe, not the cleared corridor the operation required. At 3:52 a.m., Echo Do's handler broke protocol. There was no other option. The Isfahan problem had to be solved within the next 40 minutes, and the only active asset within operational range was Echo Do, already moving away from a completed target, not compromised, carrying residual equipment. The message was short. A grid coordinate, a number, 8 minutes. Echo Do read it twice. The coordinate was not a location he had trained on. It was not a location he had ever visited. He had no briefing on the installation at that coordinate, no approach map, no obstacle assessment, no guard rotation data. He had the equipment, he had the grid. He had 8 minutes to cover 600 meters on foot and solve a problem he had never been told existed. He turned and started walking. What he did not know, what no one told him because no one in Tel Aviv had confirmed it yet, was that the cache he was being directed toward had been assembled by the agent whose communication had gone anomalous 3 weeks earlier. The agent whose market purchase had been made at the wrong location. The agent whose status was still, officially, unresolved. He was walking toward equipment that may or may not have been maintained by someone who may or may not have been operating under duress. He had 8 minutes. He started walking faster. Echo Do reached the cache location with 90 seconds to spare. The equipment was there. Sealed, undisturbed, exactly where the grid coordinate had placed it. He opened the housing, ran his hands across the components in the dark, and stopped. The arming configuration was different. Not dramatically. Not in a way that made the system unusable. But the trigger sequence, the specific combination of steps that initialized the payload, followed an older hardware logic that he had seen only once, briefly, in a footnote demonstration during training. Not his equipment, not his calibration. Someone else's cache assembled at a different time under a different operational timeline. He ran the standard sequence first. Nothing. He stopped. He did not panic. Panic was the thing that killed people in this specific kind of moment, not the obstacle itself, but the response to it. He breathed. He thought back to the footnote demonstration. The older logic initialized in reverse confirmation order: payload first, then receiver, then the base sync. He tried it. The system came live. He launched from a crouched position behind a low concrete wall, watched the drone cross the dark space between him and the relay station, and heard the impact before he saw the flash. The Isfahan air corridor was cleared with 90 seconds remaining before the dawn strike wave began its approach. He discarded the triggering device in a drainage canal. He walked back toward his apartment at the pace of someone returning from an early errand. He sent his confirmation signal at 4:21 a.m. He sat down on the floor of his apartment and waited. He would not be extracted for 11 days. Intel. Aviv, the board, showed a near-complete picture of success. The anti-aircraft batteries were gone. The command bunker had been destroyed. The scientist strikes had executed with precision that analysts were still struggling to process. The dawn strike wave flew the Isfahan corridor without incident. Not a single Israeli aircraft was lost in the opening phase, but the Khuzestan cell never reported in. Not that morning, not in the days that followed. The 2 operatives assigned to a radar installation in the southwest. The cell, whose communication anomaly had triggered the June 1st abort discussion, whose silence had been weighed against strategic windows and calculated into a proceed decision, never sent a confirmation signal. They were never heard from again. The Mossad's internal assessment, finalized weeks later, concluded with careful bureaucratic language that the 2 operatives had likely been detained prior to activation. The word likely was doing significant work in that sentence. It meant, we don't know. It meant we proceeded anyway. It meant the decision made in that room on June 1st, with incomplete information, under time pressure, accepting uncertainty as a cost of the strategic window, that decision had a human price, and the price had been paid by 2 people who were never told they were the acceptable risk. The Khuzestan radar installation, assigned to that cell, was not destroyed in the opening phase. It was struck later, by air, as part of the conventional strike package. It was destroyed. The operational outcome was preserved. The 2 operatives were not Iran reported over 600 deaths from the 12-day campaign. The IRGC's senior command had been effectively decapitated. 11 nuclear scientists were gone. Roughly half of Iran's ballistic missile stockpile had been destroyed, along with 80% of its launchers. When American bunker boasters finally reached Fordo on June 22nd, the facility that had been designed to be unreachable was reduced to rubble. By the metrics of military planning, the operation achieved nearly everything it set out to achieve. And yet, within weeks of the ceasefire, something was already moving inside Iran that the strike packages had not touched and could not touch. Iranian counterintelligence had begun what would become the most intensive internal security operation in the Republic's history. VEVAK analysts were pulling every thread they could find. Every Iranian national who had traveled abroad in the previous 4 years. Every unexplained border crossing in Khuzestan, in the northwest, in Sistan-Baluchistan. Every medical appointment made at a foreign clinic. Every university application filed through a third country intermediary. The Mossad's recruitment model, built on exploiting exactly these channels, these legal and human pathways, was now being mapped in reverse by the people it had been used against. The infrastructure agents who had maintained caches for years, inside Iran. People who had never fired a weapon, never conducted an operation, never sent a compromising communication, were being identified through transaction records, property histories, and the kind of patient pattern analysis that counterintelligence services perform after a catastrophic failure, when resources are suddenly unlimited and the political mandate is absolute. Some of those agents were already in custody by the time the ceasefire was signed. Others were found later. The Tzomet Division's expanded recruitment network, the system that Barnea had built specifically to replace Israeli operatives with Iranian nationals, the model that had taken years to construct and had performed, in the aggregate, with a precision that would be studied in intelligence programs for decades, was being systematically dismantled by the people it had been built to work against. It would take years to rebuild. If it could be rebuilt at all, there is a specific kind of damage that successful operations produce that rarely appears in the official assessments. The Mossad had demonstrated, on June 13th, what it was capable of at maximum effort. It had shown its methods, its scale, its recruitment logic, its insertion approach, its communication architecture, not in documents, in outcomes, in the specific pattern of what had been destroyed, where, and how. Vivek didn't need a leaked briefing to understand how the Mossad had operated inside Iran. The operation itself was the briefing. Former Amman Chief General Tamir Heyman assessed, in the weeks following the ceasefire, that Iran was no longer a nuclear threshold state. But he added a qualifier that received less attention than the headline, "Iran could return to that status within 1 to 2 years." The scientists were gone, the facilities were rubble, the knowledge was not. The blueprints existed in distributed form across research archives, foreign programs, and the minds of a second generation of scientists who had not been targeted because, at the time of the operation, they were not yet senior enough to appear on the Mossad's list. They were now. Echo Do was extracted on June 24th, 11 days after the operation. He crossed into a neighboring country through a route that had been used for equipment smuggling in reverse. The same border infrastructure that had brought weapons in was used, in a different configuration, to bring a person out. He was debriefed over several days. He described the arming sequence error at the relay station, the 90-second resolution, the decision to adapt rather than abort. His debriefers noted that the decision had been correct, and that the outcome had been critical to the Dawn strike wave's success. They also noted in the same report that Echo Do had operated on the assumption that the cache was maintained by a reliable asset. He had not been told otherwise. That detail, the gap between what Echo Do believed and what his handlers knew, appears in the internal assessment as a procedural observation, a note about information flow and operational compartmentalization. The language is clinical, stripped of weight, but somewhere in that gap between what an operative is told and what his handlers have chosen not to tell him is the actual texture of intelligence work at this level. Not the precision, not the coordination, not the years of patient preparation. The decisions made in rooms that the operatives never enter. The costs absorbed by people who were never told they were the margin. The 12-day war ended on June 22nd. The headlines moved on. The strategic analyses were written, published, debated, and archived. The Mossad began quietly rebuilding. Not the same network. That network was burned. A new one, with different channels, different recruitment pathways, different communication logic, designed to account for everything Vivek had just learned about how the old one worked. That work is ongoing. It does not appear in any headline. It will not until the next window opens. Hidden Ops covers the operations that don't make the official record, the decisions behind the decisions, the people who carry the weight of plans they were never fully told about. If that's the kind of intelligence history you want to understand, subscribe. We'll keep going.